Here's the question. Was Machiavelli a Machiavellian? Now, that sounds like a dumb question because, well, we'd say Plato is a Platonist, and Thomas Aquinas is a Thomist, and Shakespeare certainly wrote Shakespearean plays. But it's not a dumb question to ask, is Machiavelli a Machiavellian? Because, as I've suggested from the very beginning, and as I emphasized in the last lecture, that word, especially in the English-speaking world, has taken on certain meanings. Now, there's certainly people today, no doubt a lot of college students who read The Prince or part of The Prince in the context of a great books course or a Western Civ course or a whatever it might be, who say, well, Machiavelli sounds pretty damn Machiavellian to me, given the popular usage of that word. And we can imagine some of the passages that people might read in anthologies that include just a little bit of Machiavelli that would certainly make him seem that way. All about the well-used cruelties and when not to be good and all that sort of stuff. So it really is a serious question. Given our dictionary definition today, is Machiavelli a Machiavellian? Now, although I've suggested that, of course, Plato's a Platonist, it is important to say that very often authors are indeed mislabeled. They're either misquoted. Remember, many people think that Machiavelli invented the phrase, the ends justify the means, and Machiavelli never says that. He may have that concept. Again, it's arguable, but he certainly doesn't say those words. In one of my other courses, a course on Alexis de Tocqueville and his book Democracy in America, I began by pointing out that the very most famous line so oft quoted by Tocqueville, America is great because America is good, and when America ceases to be good, it will cease to be great, wasn't said until more than 50 years after Tocqueville died. Those are not his words. So we have to be very, very careful because we attribute ideas to people, sometimes simply through misquoting. But in a broader sense, we also know that very often thought gets mischaracterized. John Calvin would be shocked to find out what Calvinist thought is largely considered to be today. And certainly many things that are called Marxist would sure surprise Karl Marx. So we want to be very careful in making sure that we use words well. On the one hand, we need to know what Machiavellian means so that when we hear it in a conversation, we know what it means. But we also want to make sure that we know that that is not the sum total of Machiavelli's thought and may not even be an accurate summation of even The Prince, let alone the entire corpus of Machiavelli's works. Of course, by definition, there was no word Machiavellian before Niccolò Machiavelli. But let's remember, many of the things that are called Machiavellian, he certainly didn't invent. After all, the illustrations that he gives of all of his Machiavellian points are illustrations from the past. How about inhumane cruelty to achieve a goal? Hannibal did that. Cesare Borgia did that before Machiavelli wrote The Prince. So we know that although the word Machiavellian refers to this historical figure of the 16th century, it certainly also, even in its most common definition, refers to actions that took place long before, in a sense, Machiavelli collected them, codified them, justified them, and later on people gave them the name Machiavellian. We need to remember that the traits that Machiavelli is associated with in The Prince are not traits he invented. And of course, he knows that. He would be the first one to tell you that because he's the one who, after all, gives all the historical examples. Nevertheless, despite the fact Machiavelli didn't invent cruelty and dissimulation and all the other things we might associate with Machiavelli's thought, it is important to remember there is something new and something startling and perhaps something shocking about Machiavelli that we need to be aware of. It's one thing to describe the cruelty of Cesare Borgia. It's another thing to say that was good cruelty. That was cruelty well used. Really, that's a new thing in the written corpus of the West. It just doesn't appear before. I mean, there are lots of people that describe cruelty. Livy described cruelty, after all, since so much of what Machiavelli talks about came from Livy. But Livy didn't talk about it quite the way that Machiavelli does. He didn't praise it, and he didn't sort of formulate it into a part of a code of behavior, at least behavior when necessary, for a political leader. So we don't want to forget that. Saying something like cruelty can be well used, or again, to put it in Shakespeare's language with regard to Hamlet, sometimes you have to be cruel to be kind, is certainly not anything Livy says. And let's remember something that I pointed out in the earliest lectures, that although we sometimes forget it or park it aside, the Renaissance in Italy is still a period where virtually everybody claims to subscribe to Christianity. Virtually everybody goes to church. How much they mean it, it's hard to tell. But it's still an overwhelmingly Christian society. Even in Machiavelli's time, for example, the great majority of paintings commissioned in Florence are not portraits of Machiavelli or portraits of a Medici. They're paintings of the Madonna and Child. They're paintings of St. Francis of Assisi. They are works of art that have specifically religious themes. So Machiavelli is not just taking stories from Livy and other places and giving them new meaning, but he's challenging, some would say slapping in the face, but he's certainly challenging traditional Christian morality. Because obviously Christians have bought into the classical idea, which I think we can also say is a biblical idea, that personal and public morality consist of the same kind of conduct. The same rules apply to me as a person and me as a leader. And of course, in the Christian era, those are Christian-defined virtues. And now Machiavelli comes along and separates public conduct, at least in certain circumstances, from private conduct, and say what makes a good man will make a disastrous prince, and vice versa. And so we never want to forget what's new and what's not new in Machiavelli. We need to appreciate his contribution to Western thought, but also his dependence on Western thought. We need to deal with both sides of that. And therefore, and I phrased the question this way a long time ago, and I want to suggest it's a question we continue to ask and should ask, especially looking at the Prince. Is Machiavelli describing a new political morality? Is he describing immorality? Or is he simply saying there is no code of conduct, there are no rules, there are no standards, and therefore he is an amoral writer? It matters how we think about that. It matters what category we put Machiavelli into. And I want to suggest that all of those positions should be taken seriously, and all of them have been taken seriously. I quoted, for example, the great political philosopher in the 20th century, Leo Strauss, saying that Machiavelli is a teacher of evil. This is a guy whose net contribution is negative. He's a bad guy in a lot of ways because he justifies or tries to justify immoral behavior. You shouldn't cut people in half. You should never cut people in half, as Cesare Borgia did approvingly to Machiavelli, of course, of Ramiro de Orco, as we saw in The Prince. That's just, wrong to say, well, that was really a higher kind of morality. He was really being kind rather than cruel. I guess you'd have to say, tell Ramiro de Orco's family that. So we do have to consider, is that what Machiavelli is? He sort of justified political immorality. He's a teacher of evil. Or has he really constructed a new political morality? Is he right when he says what we have to focus on is if we have good goals, goals of a stable and orderly and secure society in which people can live and flourish and exercise their freedom, can we ever get there without doing some things that by traditional moral standards are deplorable? Can we get there if the person that's taken charge of a disorderly society simply says, okay, I'm in charge, now I'm just going to be nice? That's a real question. There are certainly those who say, we have to try it that way. People have certain confidence that people respond, that maybe Cicero's right. It's more important to be loved than feared. That love really is the most powerful factor, even in the political realm, not just in the personal realm. But maybe Machiavelli's right. And if you're going to have, imagine the situation he's in after all, very chaotic Italy. If you're going to have an orderly, stable society in which people can flourish, in which you can be a little old farmer and know that you can sell your goods and take that money back home with you and not be mugged on the highway, that you can raise your children without undue violence in the streets, without undue fear of attack. In a sense, I'm not putting this as Machiavelli would, but maybe you have to cut a few corners to be able to make that happen. Isn't that worth doing? Those are good questions. And we should have and continuously have this debate. Machiavelli makes us think. He pushes us sometimes to think about things we don't want to think about, to put behavior that we look at today in categories we don't want to put it into. And then, as I said, there's a third option. What if there simply is no morality? There simply are no standards. There are no rules. I don't think Machiavelli makes that argument. And he certainly, in my opinion, doesn't reject traditional Christian or classical morality in the way human beings behave around one another, the way you treat a friend or family or whatever. But I think we really do have to ask whether this kind of divorce is what it is in some ways. A divorce that Machiavelli has proclaimed as real and necessary sometimes between personal morality and the conduct of political leadership, whether that is something that we simply have to accept as the way it is, or whether, in fact, there is a higher, purer road than Machiavelli will argue, or, to change the argument a little bit, whether, in fact, if you use certain tools like cruelty, you're always going to corrupt the end you're seeking, even if it's a good end. These are really important questions to ask. Again, not so much about how mommy or daddy treat their kids or how I treat my buddy across the street, but they are good questions to ask about politics, about the way governments, about the way societies operate. And I think that we can come to very different answers. But if Machiavelli defines the questions right, if he makes us think about options we haven't considered, if he makes us read events that we see in the news differently than we've read them otherwise, then Machiavelli, even Machiavelli's Prince, is a very valuable book, I want to argue. Now, I also want to point this out. Machiavelli, as we've seen, is someone who keeps arguing for historical context and even, in a sense, gets a little testy in the Florentine histories and says, I know you're going to criticize me for too much of it, but let me tell you why I provided it. There's a kind of irony that so often Machiavelli's thought and Machiavelli's words are taken out of context. And we don't have the intellectual context. We don't have the historical context. We don't even have very often the personal context of Machiavelli's life. For most people, if they know anything about him at all, he's sort of a cardboard cutout figure, rather than somebody who worked for 14 years in the Florentine government, somebody who was an assiduous student of the classics, we just don't think of him that way. Somebody that's thoughtful, somebody who took years, let's not forget, to write the discourses. Might have written The Prince in a few months, took years to write the discourses. Studied Livy. I wonder how many times he read Livy and the other classical writers. So it's odd and ironic, perhaps, that he's so often decontextualized when we discuss him. We also need to realize that in some real sense there is a conservatism to Machiavelli. Certainly he would see it that he's anchored in the past. He's powerfully interested in the present. I'm going to make that point later when I talk about him as a thinker about history. But he loves the past. He's a student of history, as serious a student of history, let alone a writer of history, as you get. And remember that his examples, his illustrations of the points he made are not made up. They're all things that have happened. Almost never does Machiavelli make a point without saying, let me give you an example in Livy. Let me give you an example from 3 days ago. Let me give you an example from the ancient Greeks. Let me even cite Moses as an example of this or that or the other thing. It's also important to say that Machiavelli is a Renaissance thinker. He's part of this Renaissance humanist tradition. And, well, today we value the humanists. We see them in some ways as the beginners of modern thought, but we also have to know that humanists of the 16th century don't think exactly the way we do. If we're going to find Machiavelli useful or distasteful, we ought to do so after we've done our homework and put him in his context, in his city, inside his own skin, inside the intellectual world of the Florentine humanist, inside a politically messy Italy. We're much more able to make judgments about Machiavelli after we've done that kind of work. Now, having said all that, mostly about the Prince, let me return to some of the points I was making in the last lecture about Machiavelli as more than the Prince, as somebody who is an important thinker in the Western Republican tradition. And let me suggest why we need to take that seriously, both to have a historical understanding of Machiavelli rather than a cardboard cutout or a dictionary definition of Machiavellian, but also why he can provide some very valuable, if not guidance, at least he can provide some valuable ways of thinking and analyzing that are most important in a free and participatory society. Something, although in somewhat different ways, he imagined and desired. Free, equal, participatory, common good. Those are Machiavellian themes. They don't mean to him exactly what they meant to us. That shouldn't surprise us. But let's talk about, once again, the discourses and Machiavelli as a Republican thinker. As I began our discussion of Machiavelli as a Republican thinker way back at the end of The Prince, the beginning of the discourses and so on, we talk about the definition that Machiavelli starts with. It's not his definition. He takes it from Aristotle and Polybius. Mixed government. It's a very important way to think about our Constitution because that's the way our forefathers thought of the Constitution. James Madison decried democracy. He talked about a republic. As I said earlier, we take a pledge, and to the republic for which it stands, that is, say our flag stands for a republic. And certainly you can't read the discourses in a way in which he can systematically discourse about Republican government and republicanism. He takes up all the major themes. How do republics start? What are some of the things that make them work? How does a republic grow? What are a republic's goals? What can screw up a republic? What kind of safety valves do you need to have in a republic? We may not agree with any of his answers, and probably none of us would agree with all of his answers, but he asks good questions and he gives answers which are at least a starting point for discussion and serious thought and discourse. So I want to suggest that we need to take him seriously as someone who took Aristotle and Polybius and really brought their ideas into a systematic whole using so many illustrations rather than being, especially in the case of Aristotle, so much more abstract, and bringing them into a world much closer in time to our own. We've already seen that Machiavelli is in part directly and in part indirectly a contributor to that broad Atlantic Republican tradition that we find both in England and the United States. Sometimes it's hard for us to see exactly where Machiavelli is. You can't say, there's a line of the discourses. Here's what James Madison or John Jay or Alexander Hamilton says. But we can certainly see how some of the ways that Machiavelli gets incorporated into Republican thought show up. And that we can trace certain ideas we find in our documents back to Machiavellian origins, primarily in the discourses. I want to argue still another way. When we talk about politics and forms of government today, what we talk about is democracy. And rightfully so. But very often we automatically say, therefore, if we want to go back to the beginnings, if we want to go back to the ancient world to help us a little bit, we go off to Athens. That's not bad. That's a good thing to do. I still almost shiver every time I read the funeral oration of Pericles, one of the great documents about democracy of all times. But in doing that, we often forget how radically different Athenian democracy is from what we call democracy today. And it's not just because they had direct democracy and we have representative democracy. It's much more fundamental than that. However democratic our society is, we need to remember that our Constitution created a republic. We need to remember that the principles of mixed government, they're not as strict as they were in our Constitution when it was written, because we now have the direct election of senators. And even though we still have the Electoral College, we still have more of a sense, although we lost some of that in the year 2000, we have more of a sense that you add up the votes and see who wins, although we know it's apportioned by the Electoral College. But we need to remember we live in a republic. However much more, dangerous word, democratized a republic it is than the republic that was created in 1787, or the Republic of Rome, for that matter. Nevertheless, Machiavelli's sober analysis of republics and his introduction and his analysis of the ancient Roman Republic, by the way he so brilliantly uses Livy for both ideas and illustrations, Machiavelli's Discourses is a very important Republican document. And as much as we call all of ourselves small d Democrats, we also ought to call all of ourselves small r Republicans. And when we do that, we not just then we don't just look back to ancient Athens, we look back to ancient Rome, and we look back to some of the greatest commentators on ancient Rome. And there is no greater commentator on the ancient Roman Republic than Niccolò Machiavelli of Florence, this writer of the 16th century. Let me take that now to a little bit more detail. We have heard through a good deal of American history that one of the things Americans hope to do is have a world in which there are free peoples governing themselves. Again, we use the word small d democracy. The word small r republic is not as much in fashion. But I hope I've made the case that small r republic and small r republican thought is vital because of the fact we don't have the Athenian kind of democracy. If we live in a society where we say we'd like all the world's people to have a government something like ours, if not in its institutional details, after all, Florence and Venice and ancient Rome were hardly all alike, even though they were all republics. If we're looking for the world and its various chunks to become these kinds of free societies, then we need to ask the question, how do republics get formed, especially in places that haven't had them before? And how do they and must they evolve? And what are the necessary ingredients for them evolving into orderly, participatory societies with greater freedom? After all, that's what happens to the Roman Republic. It becomes sort of a partial republic and then becomes a complete republic only later on. Machiavelli says there are certain patterns. Again, he's not so much a guy that says it's inevitably happening this way, because Machiavelli talks about the fact that there is fortune. He talks about the fact that we can, if not blot out fortune, we can to some extent manipulate it and control it. We also know that no two sets of circumstances are exactly alike. But nevertheless, shouldn't we be talking about all the wisdom we can find, however partial any piece of it is, about how republics are created in societies that have never had them before, and how they function, and what the danger signs are, and how they can expand, and how they can become secure? I think those are pretty important questions, especially to people who want to export, in a broad sense, not in its constitutional details, some sort of free and open and orderly government with citizen participation and active citizenry for the common good. Machiavelli's a player in that discussion if we let him in. Not so much the Machiavelli of the Prince, although there are things to learn there too, even in this context, but the Machiavelli of the Discourses, this hard book, this long book, this forbidding book, because it's based on a book that we haven't read, that is, say, the first 10 books of Livy in so many cases. Pick it up. Read it. You won't get every detail. Get a version with some footnotes that help you fill in some of the historical blanks you don't know. Finally, I want to turn to Machiavelli as a thinker about history. Now, we get some of that, of course, when Machiavelli actually takes on the role of historian in writing the Florentine histories. But I want to argue rather that Machiavelli's most important contribution as a thinker about history is that he argues for a critical examination of the past because of his zealous interest in how we can dialogue with it and how the past can inform the present. Boy, is that important. We need to do two things, therefore. A, we need to do our homework. You don't go back and pick a story out of a bag or look at 3 lines of a book and say, that is good, because what you end up doing is using it to prove what you want to prove. Think how many days Machiavelli pored over Livy. Not because he wanted to sort of sit and dream under a tree about, the good old days of ancient Rome, or damn, I wish I'd have lived then. I mean, he has his nostalgic moments, don't we all? He did it because he wanted a better world to live in. He wanted Florence to be a true republic. It was on its way. Then the Medici came in. He's not ready to give up. And the best way he can think of to carry out his goal is to have dialogue with a Republican past. And that's so important. Machiavelli is a historian. He's a history nut. But he's not an antiquarian. He's always interested in the present. Too often, historians write to other historians, people who love history for its own sake. I love history for its own sake. But most of my students, I want to give them history as a means of analysis, as a window to the world, and teach them how to have that dialogue with the past, because they're not going to be professional historians. They're going to be lawyers and doctors and maybe steel workers. And in a participatory society, we need to have that dialogue. We can't rely only on our own wisdom, however great it might be. So Machiavelli is, to me, the poster boy for someone who recognizes the extraordinary value of getting the past right, taking it seriously, making sure we understand what we're reading and don't take the most obvious and don't take the most facile interpretation. And then say, what does this say to me now? Because ultimately Machiavelli's goal wasn't much different than ours: to live in a free and equal participatory society, because he believed that was the greatest way in which human beings can live and flourish. If you haven't given Machiavelli and all of his writings a try, give them a try.